Okay, welcome to this section 2, A-level Anthology Religious Studies section in Buddhism. And this is Rahula, and this is section 2 of the Bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism. So let's read it before we analyze it. The terms Hinayana, small vehicle, and Mahayana, great vehicle, are not known in the Theravada Pali literature. They are not found in the Pali Canon, Tripitaka, or in the commentaries of the Tripitaka. Not even in the Pali Chronicles of Ceylon, the Dipavamsa or the Mahavamsa. The Dipavamsa, about the 4th century AD, and the Pali commentaries mention the Vitannavedans, evidently a sect of dissenting Buddhists holding some unorthodox views regarding some points in the teaching of the Buddha. The Vitannavedin and the Theravadin both quote the same authorities and name the sutras of the Tipitaka in order to support their positions, the difference being only in mode of their interpretations. The Mahavamsa, 5th century AD, and the commentary on the Abhidhamma refer to the Vitula, or the Vetula Vedans, Sanskrit, Vetula Vedin, instead of Vitanda Vedin. From the evidence of the text, it may not be wrong to consider these two terms, Vitanda and Vetulya, to represent the same school or sect. So let's go through this. We've talked about the Hinayana and Mahayana, so I'll gloss over that. This term here, the Pali literature, what is that a reference to? So Pali is the language, and literature. The literature mostly is a title, not a specific text. It's concerned with Theravada Buddhism in the main, as the language of Pali is, and it's the traditional language. And we're referring to here the earliest and most important Pali literature that constitutes, in part, the Pali Canon, or the scriptures of the Theravada school, and a wider constellation of literature that is mentioned by Rahula to establish originality, authority, authenticity. Be critical of such a virtuous list of important, and you feel that Theravada theme, texts. The list is mostly of scholarly list of key Theravada texts. And there maybe are some missing texts he could have included from Burma, but we want to have a unified view of Theravada, so he maybe hasn't. What does Rahula mean by not found? He says they are not found. Does it matter? What merit has this as an argument? So the terms Hinayana, small vehicle, Mahayana, great vehicle, are not found in the Pali literature. But why would they be? These are terms invented roughly in the 2nd century. Lotus Sutra, perhaps. This is you would say this is a straw man argument. It's not that Mahayana claims, it's not or what Mahayana would dispute. The list is an argument to authorial sources. And in the East, such argumentation is way more effective than logic rhetorically. And this is very typical of Theravada apologists, citing authorial sources to support your position. So in particular, the Pali Canon, notice the difference, not the Pali literature, but the Pali Canon, or Tripitaka. The three baskets, you remember from year 12, the collective name for the Buddhist canon, which consists in the threefold collection of sacred texts. The Sutra, or Sutra Pitaka, the basket of the Buddha's sermons or discourses. The Vinaya Pitaka, or the basket specifically of monastic discipline. Many, many, many rules. Remember, some, slightly more rules for women than men. And lastly, the Abhidhamma Pitaka, the basket of higher teachings. According to tradition, this was composed the composition of the Tripitaka was determined at the Great Council of Rajagarh in the year of the Buddha's death, although some schools maintain that only the first two divisions were established at this time. Yeah, they would, wouldn't they? Definitely. What's notable is that, just before we move on, how Rahula is trying very much. He mentions the points, certain points, and it occurs to me he sees himself as a later day protector of Buddhism, in the same way that the monks of Asoka's council saw themselves protecting proper Buddhism from the heretics, writing down the points of controversy that became part of the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Very interesting. This language. So the tradition that the canon was fixed as at this early date is unlikely to be correct, since there's internal evidence of evolution and change within the three collections. The third in particular shows the greatest variation, suggesting it's the last or latest of the three to be written. Each of the early schools, and some think there were 18, some think as many as 36 different schools of early Buddhism, preserved its own version of the Tripitaka. And the one that survives intact is the canon preserved by the Theravada school in the Pali language. And that's really interesting. So why does Rahula say not even? So the commentaries and not even. Maybe it's worth just mentioning the commentaries. Commentaries here is referring to people like Buddha Agosha, who wrote exegetical commentaries. His path of purification is an attempt to clarify and solidify a pure Theravada Buddhism. That's what commentaries do. They try and make solid the meaning, the explanation of the text. See, and then he says, not even in the pot, and then he goes on. So Rahula here is referring to, and he goes on to do it, the great nationalistic poems of Sri Lanka, the chronicles in the Pali, chronicles of Ceylon, the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa. Here we have them here mentioned. The first of these, the Mahavamsa, so Maha Great Chronicle, is among the earliest of the nationalistic poems that attempts to ground Buddhism as the national religion, thus securing the patronage of the king of Sri Lanka. Yet it doesn't mention the term Hinayana. But why should it? That's a derogatory term. Why would a nationalist poem, an ode to Theravada, describe itself in a derogatory way? Why would it talk about Theravada as a less than kind of the best way? What are the Pali commentaries? Just to quote Boswell here in his explanation, he says the object of explanatory commentaries, according to tradition, is the explanation of meaning, the Atha Katha, and they were brought to Sri Lanka by Mahinda during the time of Asoka, 3rd century or so BC. The commentary is actually preserved in a revision of an earlier, now lost explanation of the Tripitaka, composed in Old Sinhalese language. During the 5th century, Buddha Agosha composed his handbook of Theravada orthodoxy for the Mahavihara and Andapura. This Vishuddhigama, the path of purification, is the centerpiece of Buddha Agosha's commentaries on the first 4 Nikyas, the long Nikyas. As stated in the respective introductions, each of the 4 commentaries comprises a full explanation of the Buddha's teaching in combination with the Vishuddhigama. Contrary to the claims of the Theravada tradition, however, Buddha Agosha wrote or supervised the writing only of these texts, huge in themselves. The commentaries on the Vinyapitaka and Abhidhamma and on part of a separate text, the Kutha Nikaya, are actually in fact anonymous. These chronicles of Ceylon, the Vamsa, the first, is the oldest historical record of Sri Lanka. It means chronicle of the island. The chronicle is believed to be compiled from Athakatha and other sources from the 3rd, 4th century, and together with the later Mahavamsa, is the source of many accounts of ancient history in Sri Lanka and India. Meaning Great Chronicle, Mahavamsa is the second of these chronicles of Ceylon, written in the 5th century in the style of an epic poem, all about the ancient kings of Sri Lanka. It relates the history of Sri Lanka from its legendary beginnings up to the reign of Mahasena of Andapura, covering the period between the arrival of the prince Vijay from India, 543 BCE, and his reign. It was composed by a Buddhist bhikkhu in Mahavihara temple of Andapura about the 6th century AD. When you get on to challenging stuff, who were Vidyavendans and all of these other names? The Vitula, the Vidyula Vedans, the Mahavihara, the great temple monastery of Sri Lankan monks, suppressed this group sometime perhaps in the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD, probably later, maybe about the year 0. And these names mean broad, extensive, total Dharma, the perfection of wisdom. Sutras perhaps is in mind here. Harvey says the teaching was heretical, not adopted by the Theravadins. So were the monks of Sri Lanka aware of the Lotus Sutra? It seems they were. And they thought of it as frivolous teaching based on jugglery of words and vain arguments. Get the cutting polemics going on here. Yet it's not clear that Mahayana was a small faction of a few heretical monks. Rather, it seems it was a widespread schism in the Sangha across India. Remember, everybody's in the same institutions, but they're having divergent beliefs, and that's causing tension. So what is the relationship between this group who call themselves the Vita Vedin and the Thera Vedin? How far is Rahula's conjoining of these an accurate reconstruction of history, or is it a reconstruction of history for his purposes? So Basham would suggest that this conjoining is contestable, that the term Theravadin is as old as the term of these heretics, is deliberately confusing the actual history, as if Theravada is the norm, and then there were these aberrations from it. Theravadin is really a term from the 20th century. Yes, the 20th century. And most Rahula could juxtapose the Mahaviharaza Vedin, the dweller of the great monasteries, with the Vitanda Vedin, as some contest the Sanskrit term Stravaka Vanda, the school of the elders, which is also claimed to have been transmitted to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BC. But the terms Stravaravada is not attested to in any Indian source. So Theravada and Stravakavada are not ancient terms. Contrary to what Rahula is doing here in wanting to claim authority and originality for Theravada. So he talks about the same authorities. They both quote the same authorities. Well, Rahula is assuming the Tipitaka and the Pali Canon to know what the great leaders were quoting and the heretics who Samuels argues were in fact just some monks from another more country outlying Vihara, a different institution, that with links in Abhayagira, followed by the Jetavana monks in their midst, were quoting. We only have the Mahavamsa and the commentary on it, which suggests their text, this Vidala Pitaka, which was considered by the leaders to be counterfeit scripture. So what we have in picture here is a very long time ago. We have divergence in the Sangha and groups pulling apart, and one group saying the other group's teaching is a counterfeit scripture. So did the Vitanda and the Vitula represent the same sect as Rahula claims? What does he say down here from the evidence, the text? It may not be wrong to consider the Vitala and Vitula represented as the same sect or school. To claim these they're the same school or sect is just a stretch. He's trying to claim institutional affiliation for the sect that implies structure and organization that just didn't exist. Surely, yes, there were competing ideas, but there wasn't a main and plain institution with these sort of dodgy other institutions fighting it. We're comparing different events from different periods of time, and Rahula is hoping you don't look too close, don't look at the detail, otherwise you may discover he's wrong. He is baffling us with big words and forgotten history, but he's probably wrong. He hasn't made the case merely by implying it. The evidence is tenuous, trying to paint Mahayana as a small breakaway group from the true Theravada history is a fake history. It wasn't like that. So this was section 2.